Today we're here to talk about time and the measurement thereof. We've all noticed we have different units of measurement, years, days, minutes, whatever. Well, why do we need all those increments? Well, I think we all know why. It's obvious. I mean, if you're using seconds, you need really finely graduated increments of time. So, seconds aren't really primarily designed to distinguish between 100 and 200 seconds, are they? What we need seconds for is to distinguish between 37 seconds and 38 seconds, or 141 seconds to 143 or 144 seconds. Those amounts of time, seconds are real useful, right? So if everyone only used blocks of 200 seconds, somewhere between 200 and 400 seconds, hey, couldn't you just be using minutes, So, yeah, well, why do we use minutes? When hours aren't enough, they're not finely enough graduated, something like 1 to 2 hours. If you're talking about the kind of things that take 71 minutes versus 73 minutes, hours just aren't enough. Saying it's somewhere between 1 and 3 hours just is too coarse of an approximation, right? So, hence, the existence of minutes, and they're often used that way. You often hear people narrowing minutes, down to only, they'll use increments of 15, 15 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that, an hour and a half, whatever. Yeah, an hour and a half, I guess that's using hours, but I suppose you could say, 90 minutes. So, sometimes you're on kind of a borderline where either minutes or hours could be used, but when you need to distinguish between, 40 and 41 minutes, minutes are great. Hours just aren't simply accurate enough, right? So now let's move on to hours, which is what this is really about. People use hours up to about 5 hours. In fact, that's kind of rare. 4 hours is more what I commonly hear. They'll talk about how long it takes to drive somewhere. 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours. Whatever it is, you hear those amounts thrown around. But as you get bigger, people stop using hours in 1 hour increments. People rarely distinguish between 15 and 16 hours. If you're talking a period of time that long, 15 hours, 16 hours, 17 hours, 1 hour is probably finely enough graduated for you. I don't know that you need to go to minutes necessarily, because, 1 hour, if you're talking that many of them, is probably narrowing it down enough, right? But what happens is once you get above a certain amount, literally less than 10, people make this jump. They only start using increments of 12 hours, right? Have you ever heard anyone say 53 hours? Probably not before you heard me say it just now. This is probably also the first time you've ever heard anyone say 92 hours. Have you ever heard anyone say the word 92 and hours consecutively? My suspicion is for most of you, this is the first time. Well, why is that? Because people only start using these big blocks. Remember how I mentioned, seconds, if you used only 200 or 400 seconds or something, you wouldn't really be using seconds anymore for what they're intended for, right? A second's a really small amount of time. It's great to distinguish between 10 and 11 seconds. Second's an ideal thing. But to distinguish between 200 and 400 or 500 seconds, just probably have a better increment to use. But when people start talking about relatively long periods of time, longer than 5 hours, certainly longer than 10, they'll only use 24, occasionally 36, but 48 and 72, Those will be the ones anyone uses. No one says 70 hours, right? No one says, well, we expect some improvement, like you might hear in a hospital, within 70 to 71 hours. No one will ever say that. They'll say, we expect 72 hours. Really? The fact that everyone ever heard, quote, a fairly large amount of hours used an increment of 12. So really, by some wild coincidence, this genius doctor figured it would be very close to exactly 72. He didn't say between 73 and 74. He didn't even say 70. How when you're talking, minutes, people use increments of 10. Oh, it might be 20 minutes, it might be 30 minutes. People might say something like that, right? But no one ever does with hours. No one ever says, oh, that'll be 40 and 50 hours. They'll say, oh, that'll be between 48 and 72. right? It'd be 48 and 72 hours. That's a preposterous amount of time, you know? I mean, couldn't you just be using days? You know, I mean, that's kind of like the people that say, oh, that'll be between 120 and 180 days. Give us months. Say that, you know, we expect a child to walk or talk within a certain amount of months or even years, instead of saying some, you know, ridiculously large amount of days where you're not really using days. You're trying to use a smaller increment to make it sound like you have it a little more finely graduated in your mind. You figured it out a little better. You're trying to use a little more accuracy. You know, basically you're trying to mislead people. And so, you know, I touched on the medical community. That's a place to commonly hear something like, oh, we're looking at between 36 and 72 hours. Really? Not 40 to 50? Not 40 to 70? You know, I mean, that's a ridiculously broad spread. You know, talk about an approximation. That's like saying, yeah, I expect a kid to, you know, walk and talk somehow within the first 6 years. Yeah, well, yeah, you know, I would hope so. You can't narrow it down a little you know, further. You can't say, yeah, 2.5 years, 3 years, a year and a half, depending on what you're talking about. So yeah, the next time you hear someone that uses only increments of 12 hours, they're just parroting what they've heard their whole lives. They don't know. If they actually thought about it, knew that it would be 50 to 55 hours, they'd say, yeah, that's, you know, this should be, you know, within 50 to 55 hours this should take. Whatever it is. It doesn't have to be something medical. Maybe I shouldn't single them out, although they're experts at using multiples of 12 and multiples of 24. No one even uses 60. I guess that's a multiple of 12, right? That's like using, you know, a fraction of a day, but not a very small fraction, you know, half a day, 12, you know, a day and a half, 2.5, you know, but they don't, like I said, they don't even use 60. It goes 24, 36, occasionally used. Then we're looking at 48 to 72. So, you know, people say that because it's what they've heard their whole life, you know. It sounds more impressive than saying days. Well, between 2 and 3 days, or between 2 and 4 days. If you say something like that, we all know that you're giving a very broad generalization. You know, that's really kind of a wild guess. You're just giving real ballpark if you use time, you know, terms like 2 days, 3 days, you know, 4 or 5 days or whatever. So people try to use hours instead, you know, very, very unimpressive. So when anyone ever gives you that kind of thing, you probably should make a comment on it like, oh, really? Not 50 to 60 hours, huh? Really? 48 to 72? That's as close as you can narrow this down. So yeah, let's use the increments of time measurement that are most applicable to the amount of times we're talking about. If we need to use years, let's use years. Seconds if appropriate, you know, but using these, you know, colossal amounts of hours, but only use them in increments that you've heard people use your whole life. Very unimpressive. So keep that in mind. This is the way of life.